the world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important, we have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
My name is Rajesh Hadi. I've been participating in the Edinburgh International Book Festival for many years. The festival has been central to my development as a writer. The thrill I feel as I enter Charlotte Square has never waned. I could always count on excellent programming and stimulating discussions. There has never been a time when such meetings are more important.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Edinburgh Festival 2020, sponsored by the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust. My name is Matthew Ryder, and I'm very excited to be in conversation this evening with the journalist, Amelia Gentleman. Hi, Amelia.
Hi.
Well, it's really, really exciting for me to be here with an opportunity to have a discussion with you about the incredible book you've written, The Windrush Betrayal. And it really follows from your journalism with The Guardian about what's now been commonly referred to as the Windrush Scandal. You're an Orwell Prize-winning journalist, you're an Orwell shortlisted writer for this book, and some of the journalism that you've uncovered in The Guardian over many years has been at the forefront of really giving voice to people who have suffered at the hands of the state or have had difficulty getting their stories told. But I don't think there's anything really that has had quite the impact by any journalist in recent years as you're writing in the Guardian on this particular issue. So it's extremely exciting to have you here tonight. Before we get into it, I was just going to mention a couple of things to those that have joined us. First of all, Amelia and I are going to be in conversation about 45 minutes. With hopefully about 50 minutes of questions at the end, and feel free to, there should be, for everybody who's listening in, there should be on your screen a way you can send questions to us. So by the end, with 50 minutes to go, we'll have them to be able to ask questions you put forward to Amelia. There should be, I hope, an opportunity for you to buy Amelia's amazing book at the end through the through the Edinburgh Book Festival shop. So I'll talk to you about that at the end. But it's really exciting for us to be in a position where we can have a discussion about it. And for me, I think if I wasn't having a conversation with you, I'd probably be wanting to listen in, because it's had a lot of impact for me personally as well as professionally. So could you really begin by telling us a little bit about how the story came to you and how you ended up really writing about this subject, and you know, how you ended up kind of being at the forefront of this story?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks so much for having invited me here, the organisers. I'm thrilled to be at the festival. I'm really very, very happy to be talking about the book I've written, because in a way, quite sadly, it's been now 2.5 years since I've been thinking about this issue and writing about it. And it's something that remains incredibly politically live in a way that I don't think I would have expected it to be when I first began talking about it, because so many of the issues remain entirely unresolved. And although we've had 2.5 years or 2 years now of promises from politicians that this would be something that would be fixed, it really hasn't been. So I'm thrilled to be here talking to you about it and explaining why it's still something that we need to be thinking about and need to not assume has been in any way dealt with.
I think we're going to, hopefully we're going to get a chance at the end. There's a fantastic postscript in your book which talks about sort of the lasting work or the continuing work on this. But before we get to kind of the what's not yet been resolved, and there is a lot about that, it's fascinating to find out how you ended up, really how you came across it, and what triggered you to start writing it.
Yeah, so it was really quite a random series of events that set me along a road thinking about this issue and investigating it. And I don't think at all that I had any sense when I first began to write about it of quite what the scale of the problem was.
When was this you first came across it?
So I had an email from a charity in Wolverhampton in the autumn of 2017 saying that they were really, really worried about one of the people that they'd been trying to help for a while. This was the Refugee and Migrant Centre in Wolverhampton, a small charity that I'd visited a few years before that on a completely different story that had taken me to Wolverhampton. And they emailed me saying that they were very concerned about the imminent deportation of a grandmother who'd been in Britain for almost 50 years and who was being sent back to Jamaica, a country that she hadn't visited for half a century and that she'd left at the age of 10. So at the time that they emailed me, she was in Yarl's Wood, which is one of Britain's most notorious immigration removal centres, and had been booked on a flight back to Jamaica. So that email in itself, entirely on its own merits, was quite extraordinary, because although I write a lot about immigration and the problems with deportations and immigration removal, it's really, really unusual to come across somebody who's been here for 5 decades who was facing deportation for no apparent reason.
And the way it comes across in the book is that you, your initial feelings as you start working on it was that you thought it must be some glitch in the system. There must be some error or mistake that's going to be sorted out.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was a mistake. A really terrible mistake to have made. So, a significant enough mistake to warrant going to Wolverhampton and talking to Paulette. By the time I met her, this is a woman called Paulette Wilson, who very sadly died only last month, very prematurely. And I can explain a bit more about that in time, but an amazing woman who I feel really lucky to have met a number of times over the last 2 years. she was in Yarlswood when the charity got in touch with me. And by the time I was able to speak to her, her MP had got involved. And at the 11th hour, she was actually at Heathrow in a new immigration removal centre. She could hear the aeroplanes taking off above the place where she was being held. But she was luckily released just before deportation after her MP got involved.
I mean, your book opened.
I went to visit her home and met her, and I met her daughter. And it wasn't immediately obvious to Paulette that it was a good idea to talk to a journalist. It takes an enormous amount of courage, I think, from people who have been told that they are illegal immigrants or immigration offenders to want to go to a newspaper and talk about that. I mean, the logical thing to do is to hide, really.
So your book opens, the opening of the book is Paulette's story, and really is about Paulette on the brink of being deported. Yeah. And it's an amazing, for those who are listening in who've read it, it's extremely moving, extremely powerful. It can almost bring you to tears when you read it. It must have been pretty traumatic to be speaking to Paulette and then other people. The sort of impact as you realise how severe this is on the lives of people who've been here for 40 years or whatever. Must have been emotionally charged.
Well, when Paulette described her sensation of waiting for deportation and trying to work out what she'd done wrong, why she was being treated as an illegal immigrant when she'd never broken the law in her life, it is really an incredibly disturbing story. So I went and I met her, and I met her daughter, Natalie Barnes, who is a kind of big campaigner now on this issue. And I went back to London, I wrote a story, we published it in The Guardian, and the response was immediate from our readers. There was a total sense of outrage, people feeling very horrified that we have an immigration system that would do this, even if it were a mistake, that it just felt completely draconian and wrong to be locking up a grandmother who'd done absolutely nothing wrong. And at the very least, a complete waste of public funds to be spending all of that money locking someone up for absolutely no reason.
I think the interesting thing for me about it, starting when you start the story in your book, we know as we read the book that it's about a systemic problem. These aren't one-off awful cases. These are a whole system, of thousands of horrible cases. But the interesting thing, I think, for me, it chimed for me as a lawyer. I've worked on lots of important civil liberties cases that are very important for people. So for me, it had really powerful impact as a lawyer. I was Deputy Mayor of London for Social Integration. We worked on Windrush with the mayor, so it really resonated with me on that level. But also I think, my mother came from Jamaica in 1960. She's from that very generation that features in the book. And just, so my Caribbean heritage, and as a Caribbean British person, it was very impactful for me. And then on top of all of that, just as a British person, just as somebody who hopes that something like this wouldn't happen in this country, it's a shock to the system. And even when I knew the story, the way you set it out and you read it, so as it unfolded in real time for you, at what point did you realize this is not a story of individual mistakes, this is a systemic problem?
So it was a really, really slow and, for me, incredibly frustrating period of investigation, because almost immediately that we published a piece about Paulette, I began to get phone calls and emails from other people who said, you must come and speak to my father, or you must talk to somebody I know who's having similar difficulties. And actually, even talking to Paulette, it was already obvious that she wasn't a one-off, because the caseworker who was helping her from the charity in Wolverhampton had come across a number of elderly Commonwealth-born people who were approaching retirement age, who'd been in the UK since they were children, but who were having a series of problems. And not all of them had been arrested and threatened with deportation, as Paulette had, but a number of them had been told that they weren't eligible for their pensions, or they were told that they weren't allowed to work, or that they were having difficulties with their housing. So I had a sense already from that caseworker that there was some kind of problem, but it wasn't.
Well, couldn't have operations. I mean, you described one person who was denied national NHS care.
Yeah. So it became
cancer treatment because of their status.
It became, to begin with, I wasn't really clear about the severity of it, and I wasn't clear at all about how widespread it was. And you said something very interesting to me when we were talking before this about how, you know, I felt like I was discovering something, but it was actually that I was catching up on what a lot of people were aware of, dotted around in different parts of the country. And so there were a lot of people who knew about this, but I think nobody knew quite what the scale was. But remind me what it was that you said about discovering food, or
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I think sometimes, you know, you can discover an interesting something in an area or in a country, you know, a dish or something like that, and you think, I'm the first person to discover this, not realizing that there are people who've been working on this for years. And so you end up being credited with or being associated with the person who discovered this problem. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that many of us know within Caribbean communities across the country, you know, half of the Caribbean community of the UK lives in London, but there are Caribbean communities across the country who were facing this issue in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Leeds, everywhere. And there were community activists and lawyers like Jackie McKenzie or people like Patrick Vernon, who were all over the country, basically trying to tell this story, trying to find it out, and trying to get somebody to listen, and trying to get somebody who has the sort of platform that you had for writing, to be able to say, please tell our story. So it's in a way, this story was going around, and on one level, it's important to recognize the people who were doing that. On another level, it's a bit of an indictment of everybody before you who heard about it. I'm not just talking about journalists, but politicians, all sorts of people who heard about it and just sort of thought, well, this thing isn't as big as it seems, or this thing isn't as worrying as it might sound. And you really sort of realized there was a scale to this that other people had missed.
So that is absolutely true. I was kind of wading into an area of immigration law that is incredibly complex, wasn't an area of specialism for me, but I suppose possibly because I was so wide-eyed and new to it, and in no way kind of jaundiced by having heard these stories before, I was immediately horrified by Paulette's story, and then by the next person I interviewed, who was a man called Anthony Bryan, whose son emailed me the day of the publication of Paulette's story, saying, you must come and talk to my father. He's only just been released after 5 weeks in immigration detention, and he too has been booked on a flight back to Jamaica, a country he left as a 9-year-old 50 years ago. So pretty much an identical story, another entirely law-abiding man who had no idea why the Home Office had classified him as an illegal immigrant when he believed rightly that he was in the country legally and was effectively a British citizen.
So Amelia, sorry, I mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, just to say, so I went to interview him, and again was completely horrified by his story. So I think right from that point, and he again also told me about a number of people who he knew who were facing similar immigration problems or citizenship problems that were making them homeless or unable to work. And for him, it was very, I was very surprised by how unshocked he was, I suppose, by his treatment. And I felt I was kind of being very naive in the horror that I felt when he told me about it. And he was saying, no, but, you know, this has happened to this person and that person.
Well, like so many of the stories, you know, with Anthony Bryan's story and various others, they don't always have the same reaction to their injustice. Some are very animated, you know, feel very forceful about it. Others are almost resigned to the fact that this kind of thing happens to them. And I think that what's so beautiful about the book is how you tell each story as they go along, and they're so different, even though they all are facing, you know, such a horrible circumstance. So before we go a bit further, if it's possible to do so, there will be people who will be watching this thinking, how on earth did this even happen? How did the law get to a situation where people who've been in this country for 50 years or 40 years came as children, sometimes came on British passports before the country they came from had independence? How did we get to this situation? So I know it can be very complicated, but if you can, in a nutshell, give us a feel of how we ended up in this situation, that would be really interesting, I think, for some people.
Yeah, so it is complicated, and I suppose the way that I see it now is kind of remembering how mystifying it was to me as somebody who was week after week as a journalist interviewing these people who'd had these really catastrophic consequences as a result of having been told by the Home Office that they were here illegally, that they were illegal immigrants. And I couldn't understand it. I couldn't find politicians who were on top of it.
Lawyers.
There were a few lawyers, but it was difficult for me to understand what was going on, and it was something that I became clearer about as the weeks went on. But essentially, it's the kind of catastrophic clashing of two areas of legislation. One is historic, and one is the relatively new hostile environment that came around with David Cameron and Theresa May. But we have to go back very quickly to 1948, when there was essentially an amazing bit of legislation that created free movement between people who were living in Britain's colonial outreaches and the UK. And at that point, if you lived in Jamaica, it was entirely legal for you to get on a boat, come to the UK. There was no immigration that you had to do. You just came, and you were subject of the UK and the UK and colonies at that time. And you came, you didn't have to fill in any forms. You arrived here, and that was fine. After 1948, as tens of thousands of people began to migrate to the UK.
1948 was obviously when the Windrush came, so we're talking about...
there were those two bits of legislation, the two instances in 1948, the legislation and also just before it, the arrival of the Windrush ship that had, I think, about 500 people from the Caribbean on it. But politicians, having been incredibly liberal with that legislation, very quickly over the years and decades that followed, moved to restrict immigration to the UK. And so by 1971, it was actually no longer possible to migrate to the UK from Commonwealth countries without going through a very complex procedure. But anybody who'd come before 1971, more or less, and I'm sorry, Matthew, because I know that I'm kind of very blithely skating over all of the nuances. Before 1971, it was pretty simple. You arrived, nobody was asking you to go through any of the kind of intricate naturalization. You just arrived. You might have had a stamp in your passport, or you might not. And the significance of that stamp in your passport was not made clear, or indeed, in fact, it wasn't very significant at that time. So you had, before 1971, tens of thousands of people who'd arrived here entirely legally, but who didn't have any clear documentation saying that they were here legally. And that was all fine, really, until 2010 onwards, because we don't have very much of a kind of papers, please culture in this country. Until recently, it's been absolutely fine not to have a passport, and something like 17% of the population don't have passports. So it wasn't really a problem for most people until the implementation of the hostile environment policy, which came in really about 2012. And that came about as part of a desire by the coalition government and the Conservative manifesto commitment to reducing net migration to the UK to the tens of thousands. The Conservatives were very, very keen to do this because they were so worried about UKIP coming, and they were talking endlessly about immigration numbers. So the Conservatives wanted to be looking to be very, very tough on immigration. They introduced the hostile environment policy, which began to ask people to show documents if they wanted to get a job, if they wanted to get housing, if they wanted to get healthcare. And that is the point at which tens of thousands of people who were here entirely legally, people who'd arrived as children, suddenly found that they were being routinely told by the Home Office that they were illegal immigrants. And we know an awful lot about the hostile environment now, almost as a result of Windrush. But when I began to write about it in 2017, it wasn't particularly a kind of a concept that people were talking about. It was a bit of policy that had been introduced by Theresa May. Anyone working in immigration knew about it. Anybody who had a problem with the Home Office knew about it, but it wasn't something widely understood. And so, yeah, for me, it was a kind of process of getting to understand.
I think your book, for non-lawyers and lawyers, but for everybody, the way you describe it in the book is really compelling, because you set out what the hostile environment really means, and you put it in the context. And I've got to say, even if you had negative views about the participation of David Cameron and Theresa May in the hostile environment process, the way your book describes their role is just so striking. You can't help but think that the enduring legacy of Theresa May's time as Home Secretary will be her enthusiasm for this particular policy. Could I just read a very short few sentences from one bit of your book about this, where you say, it's during a chapter which says, what good is an apology when you're dead? And you say, excuse me, clearly there was no government master plan to deliberately target older people of West Indian origin. But the Windrush Scandal is a textbook example of institutional racism. And you go on to say, in his report on the flawed investigation into the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence, Sir William Macpherson defined institutional racism as something that could be seen in attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. And you say, at the very least, there was much government thoughtlessness and ignorance in the development of the hostile environment and in the failure to deal with its effects. So, I mean, the way you describe it is that this policy was allowed to run wild, and even if it wasn't deliberately targeted at older Caribbean people, they were allowed to suffer the horrendous consequence of it in a way that was effectively, as you describe it, institutionally racist.
Well, I think what we now know, and what I began to find out as I was doing the reporting, was that the government, as it implemented those policies, received a number of very, very precise warnings about the likely impact of introducing these kind of border checks. So outsourcing border checks to people like landlords, to employers, and to untrained hospital staff would be that it would impact adversely on people who were here, people in exactly this cohort. And for whatever reason, the civil servants and the ministers decided that that was a risk that they were prepared to embrace in the greater good of getting through this policy, which was designed to bring down net migration. And bringing down net migration it's kind of important to remember what a kind of time it was politically with UKIP rising in its popularity at every kind of European vote that there was. And it was their key, it was very, very high on the political agenda. And I think we really see Theresa May's fingerprints on this, but talking to a lot of the people involved in the development of the hostile environment legislation, it was clear that this was a very important priority for David Cameron as well.
Yeah, I think that bit your book really brings out in a way that I think most people aren't aware of. You know, that the softer side of David Cameron is really kind of stripped away when you see how enthusiastic he was about this. But there's so many amazing things to talk about in the book. There's a section on, trying to find records of people in Croydon, which is a sort of this was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. It's Orwellian, to use a kind of tired phrase, but it's really Orwellian to describe how the records weren't there and people would have to go to a different building, into a basement, and sometimes they didn't bother with an inquiry. So there's so many interesting bits, and also just incredible stuff that The Guardian did to put it out there, or Commonwealth heads of government and High Commissioners, Guy Hewitt from Barbados in particular, did. But I really we've not got that much time, so I would really like to get a little bit into some of the people and the stories of the people themselves. But before we do that, I think there's a short film that you put together that's been on The Guardian before, but maybe we could just play that for a little bit.
Can I just, before we go to the film, I just want to explain that the film explains how it was that this suddenly kind of went from being a story that The Guardian was very, very concerned about, but which for whatever reason wasn't particularly picked up by other newspapers and wasn't getting an enormous amount of political traction until April of 2018, when there was this Commonwealth Heads of Government summit in London, and then suddenly everything kicked off, and finally the government was shamed into apologising really at the 11th hour. And this is what the film reminds us.
Yeah, well, if we play the film, there's a little bit about that. Some of the story behind that is fascinating, and I do want to get to the people involved, but let's play the film, and you can talk us through some of the really interesting sort of almost behind the scenes stuff that The Guardian is having to do for that. So perhaps if we play the film now, we can talk about it when that's done.
I'm going to turn my light on.
They've come to seek work in Britain and are ready and willing to do any kind of job that will help the motherland along the road to prosperity.
The relationship between this country and the West Indies and Caribbean is inextricable. When my parents and their generation arrived in this country under the Nationality Act of 1948, they arrived here as British citizens. Thousands of British men and women denied their rights in this country under her watch in the Home Office. Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I share the Honourable Gentleman's admiration for the people who came here from the Caribbean and contributed so much to our society.
I want to apologise to you today because we are genuinely sorry for any anxiety that has been caused.
I think that gives us a flavour of kind of what was going on at the time. I've got to say, when I saw Amber Rudd at the end there, and Theresa May, one of the things that I love about the book is that it's got a really simple, very compelling, straightforward style. But there are times when you interview Amber Rudd, or when you describe a particular official, there's just some lovely little asides in parentheses, little brackets at the end of the sentence, which kind of give a little sly kind of insight into kind of what is behind some of their comments. And it seems as though there was quite a lot of, tradecraft by you and The Guardian in getting it out. So the book begins, as people might know, with an introduction by the Guardian editor-in-chief, Kath Viner, who explains how The Guardian at one point put the story on the front page for 2 weeks, every single day, 2 weeks, in order to make sure that it happened. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of behind the scenes things you're trying to do to get the story told, and how you got it to, High Commissioners and people like that?
Yeah, so So as the months went on after I'd met Paulette Wilson, it became clear to me and clear to editors at The Guardian that there was something going on that was really terrible, and that was affecting not just a handful of people, but hundreds. And then it became clear that it was thousands. And then it became clear that it could actually be affecting tens of thousands of people. But it was incredibly slow for the government, for ministers, and actually even for opposition politicians to get engaged and to get angry about it. And I still find it quite hard to know why it was. And I think partly, again, that goes back to this sense that this was a cohort of people that just wasn't at the forefront of people's minds. So, it's still something I struggle with. But it wasn't. Well,
they didn't care. They didn't care about Caribbean people. Is the feeling that the Caribbean community feels.
Yeah, it sounds unbelievable to think that could be the case, but we were running story after story of people whose lives were really being ruined by this Home Office mistake. So you mentioned a man called Sylvester Marshall who needed life-saving cancer treatment and was told that he would have to either produce a British passport, which he didn't have, or pay £54,000 for NHS treatment. We met people who were made homeless, people who'd been sacked from their jobs, people who were pushed into real destitution. And yet it wasn't something, it was raised by Jeremy Corbyn at Prime Minister's Question Time, and Theresa May just didn't know what he was talking about. So it was only when we put a piece on the front page of The Guardian just before that Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit, saying that the High Commissioners from the Caribbean had requested a meeting with Theresa May during this kind of just friendly summit to raise the issue of the Home Office's treatment of people. And Number 10 had said that they didn't have time for such a meeting. And that was perceived to be a real diplomatic snub, potentially also a racist snub. And we put that on the front page of The Guardian. And at that point, a story that we had been very, very worried about became a national story, and for a while an international story. And within 24 hours, Amber Rudd was apologising at the dispatch box. And we saw, as we saw in that clip, Theresa May apologising. Although I don't know if you noticed, but her apology is quite kind of lukewarm. And she says...
I love that aspect of you describing the various apologies from Theresa May, Sajid Javid, who became Home Secretary after Amber Rudd, and Amber Rudd. And you sort of unpack in the book how the apologies were often not apologies at all. They were apologies for causing anxiety, or apologies for offending, or even a frustration that I've already apologised before, so now I'm apologising again. For those of us that watch, TV shows and politics shows and are frustrated at politicians, you do a lovely job of explaining how just ludicrous some of the apologies are, or ineffectual they are.
It was very, very, very upsetting to see, on the one hand, that we were being apologised to, and yet the apologies initially were pretty meaningless. Then Amber Rudd was forced to resign on a kind of technicality, but essentially because of an understanding of how badly her department had handled all of this. And we did have it on the front page of The Guardian for 2 weeks, but that was it was in large part because that was the news for 2 weeks. And we were suddenly then... The kind of the scale of the number of people getting in touch to say this has happened to me too exploded, and it was extraordinary. We had thousands of emails.
There's a little bit in the book where that is one of the rare bits where you're kind of explaining, personally. There's a nice bit at the end when you talk about going to Jamaica and experiencing Jamaica, and I think there's a really interesting aspect of that, which is that you talk about it as an English person going to Jamaica and things being unfamiliar and some of the aspects of Jamaica. And when I was reading that, as someone who's spent a lot of time in Jamaica in my childhood and as an adult, I thought, well, that's just, what it's like for an English person going to Jamaica for the first time. What I thought was so brilliant about the way you portrayed that was you then realise as you're writing it that what you're explaining is how it was for many of the Windrush people. They would be experiencing Jamaica through the same fresh eyes of something being unusual or different or unfamiliar that you were, and you realise you were almost telling the story of the unfamiliarity of Jamaica from your eyes that the people you're writing about had from their eyes, even though they were being deported back there. So there's another lovely bit I really liked in the book about you explaining this period when it was all kicking off, when you were kind of reading till 2 o'clock in the morning, getting up at 5. Your arm was so painful because you'd been typing so much. The intensity of what was going on at that time, I think, is pretty vivid. But we've not got long before questions, so I should probably, could you just give us a little feel about, well, I think we'll get to the postscript of what's coming into the future when we look at the questions, but could you give us a little, just a few pen portraits in a couple of minutes about some of the people who you describe so well in the book? I think it's impossible to do justice to their description and their lives in the really detailed and moving way you do in the book. But if you could just give us, a few accounts of people, I think it would be really helpful.
Can I read a little bit about Joycelyn John? So Joycelyn John is, I think, the worst case that I came across. I mean, every case in its own way is so upsetting. But Joycelyn is somebody who arrived in the UK in 1963 at the age of 4. She travelled with her mother from Grenada, travelling on her mother's passport, and she arrived here as a British subject. So she went to primary school, secondary school in London. She worked in London all of her life. For a while, she worked at the Ritz and later at the Hilton. But around 2009, she lost her passport, which contained the crucial stamp that gave her indefinite leave to remain in the UK. And there was no reason why she should have thought that was a particularly significant loss. She applied for a new passport, but because there was a kind of complicated bureaucratic issue with her having changed her name, she was told she couldn't get a new passport. So she spent several years trying to sort out her papers without success. But by 2014, she had been classified as someone who was living in Britain illegally. She lost her job and was unable to find new work because she had no papers. She could no longer afford her rent, so for a while she was living in a homelessness hostel. But she lost her bed there because the government does not fund hostel places for people who are classified as illegal immigrants. So she spent 2 years staying with relatives, sleeping on sofas or on the floor. During that time, she managed to gather 75 pages of evidence proving that she had spent a lifetime in the UK. Bank statements, dentist records, medical files, national insurance and tax records, letters from her primary school and from friends and family. But inexplicably, this was not enough to satisfy immigration staff. Every letter Joycelyn received from the Home Office warned her that she was liable to be detained and deported to Grenada, a country she had left more than 50 years earlier. She began to feel nervous about opening the door in case immigration officers were outside wanting to put handcuffs on her and drive her away. She received a Home Office leaflet encouraging people to opt for a voluntary departure. The leaflet was illustrated with cheerful, brightly coloured aeroplanes and published around the same time as the Go Home vans were launched in South London. The leaflet said, "We know many people living in the UK legally want to go home, but feel scared of approaching the Home Office directly. They may fear being arrested and detained, but for those who return voluntarily, there are key benefits. They avoid being arrested and having to stay in detention." This appeal for a desire for a dignified departure was a shrewd tactic on the part of the Home Office. Joycelyn John was so concerned about the prospect of being taken away from the UK in handcuffs that she decided finally to accept a so-called voluntary departure back to a country that she had left almost 50 years earlier. Officials booked her on a flight on Christmas Day, and when she asked if she could spend a last Christmas with her brother and her 5 sisters, staff rebooked her on a flight on Boxing Day. A final Home Office letter told her, "You are a person who is liable to be detained. You must report with your baggage to Gatwick, South Virgin Atlantic Airways. You may not," it informed her that her baggage allowance, as she packed up after a lifetime in the UK, was 20 kilos. And she was told, "You will be expected to pay for any excess." So this is somebody who has had an entire lifetime in Britain, who was so terrified by the Home Office that she accepted a flight to go back to a country that she'd left over 4 decades earlier. And talking to Joycelyn, who luckily is back in this country now because she was flown back after the Home Office realised its mistake after this came to public attention. She is obviously thrilled to be back in the UK, but her life has been comprehensively torn up by this mistake. And I haven't spoken to her in the last month, but when I last spoke to her, she still hadn't received any compensation.
I mean, I think it's difficult to really convey the emotions that I'm sure not everybody listening to that is feeling. You know, there's rage, there's immense distress. You know, it's a really powerful account. And I'd like to come to the questions really, because some of them touch exactly on that. Before I do, we're coming up to time for questions, and we've not got that much time, but just to say, obviously the compensation scheme is going through. The estimated kind of 500,000 or whatever it is that it was initially put into the scheme, I think the actual compensation is going to be, well, we don't know yet because hardly any's been given out, but what's the estimate of what you think might be the overall compensation that could potentially be paid out at the end?
So when the scheme was launched last year, officials thought that it could be somewhere between 200 million and 500 million pounds paid out. People simply don't know because we still don't know exactly how many people were affected. That looks like it's a kind of way overestimate, but the really sad thing is that something like £100,000 only has been paid out to somewhere around 50 people. I'm actually, I think there may have been an update on the numbers of people, but it's
about 500,000 has been paid out so far, something like that.
Very small amount.
But it's a tiny proportion, so it's 500,000 that's actually gone out so far, and 500 million, which is the estimate of what will need to be paid out. Amelia, I'm going to come to some of the questions if I can. So. Really the first one coming off the back of what you've just read is from Jackie K. And Jackie says, did having a moral imperative to tell this story help you deal with the anguish of the lives of the people you met? And what kept your spirits going as a writer, as a journalist during that period?
So I think it's true to say that this was a very unhappy making thing to report on. And I know that journalists are meant to be very neutral and pretty thick-skinned, but it would not be true to say that I was able to write about this without feeling really, really upset and angry about what people experienced. And it still makes me very upset and angry. But on the other hand, I've been a journalist for 20 years. I've written a lot about policy failures and things that I felt like perhaps, ideally ministers might read an article and think, oh yes, we must change that bit of policy. This has been the only time really that I've seen such a clear impact from the journalism that I've done. And that is a very, very positive feeling because there was a real mistake and to a certain extent, that mistake is on the way to being cleared up. And And so I do feel really cheerful when I get emails from people who say, you know, they've got their citizenship or they've been able to go back to work. And something like 12,000 people now have got documentation who didn't previously have it. And that documentation says that they're living in the UK legally, which they always were. So in some sense, kind of so what? But it means that they're no longer worried about immigration enforcement. And that is a really good thing.
I mean, it's extremely positive that that's happened. At the same time, when you read it in your book, there is a period after the government had decided to change their position, you know, set up a compensation fund and started to give people their papers, where you describe, I think it's Anthony Bryan, going to the Home Office and presenting the same document he's been presenting for 30 years, only for some, it may not be him, it may have been one of the others, but only for the Home Office official to suddenly have a completely different attitude, be smiling. And although the positivity with which he's now being treated comes through, in between the lines of what you're writing, you can't help feeling that both you and he in that process were thinking how disgusting it was that he was put through that.
Yeah, heartbreaking. And many people who have got their documentation now describe exactly that sense of misery at the speed with which they're given these papers, which are so crucial, or have become so crucial to living in the hostile, under the hostile environment. And it's just, really upsetting.
I'll get to another question now, which sort of follows on from what you were saying, which is that Stephen Plastock has said, after the initial story broke, the government responded by saying that they would do everything in their power to resolve Windrush. How can we make our leaders accountable for their actions? In other words, how do we hold them to account for what they've said they will do on Windrush? Do you think that's going to be an effective process?
So we've had now 2 prime ministers apologising and 3 home secretaries. And so on the one hand, I feel fairly weary about Priti Patel's apologies and her commitment to reform. I think
weary for most of us is an understatement, but yeah.
But on the other hand, if you take her words at face value, actually, they are. She is now promising a very comprehensive reform of the Home Office, a review of the hostile environment and its effectiveness, and wants to have a Home Office that is more rooted in humanity and understanding that individuals, that everyone who applies to the Home Office is an individual. So I still, maybe naively, I still want to believe that the process that is underway at the moment and that we are going to be tracking over the autumn may have an impact. And I suppose if the question is what do we need to do in order to make sure that happens, we need to go on talking about it and thinking about it and not let this issue get kind of swept under the carpet.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns about that is that the treatment of the Windrush generation, the treatment of Windrush people was callous and unfeeling and institutionally racist. And then when it emerged through your writing and through the activities of others like the Commonwealth High Commissioners and others, leaders, the government realised how appalling their behaviour had been. People resigned and this has happened. But that sense of humanity needs to extend to the next group of people. You know, you've written, apart from this, about people in Yarlswood and in other situations. You know, when you're seeing people on boats and the what seems to now be the treatment coming for those people, that has that sense of humanity that should have caused the government to change track on this stuff. Has that really occurred, or are we at risk of repeating those similar errors, whether it's people in boats coming over or it's young people who aren't registered with the right papers who are still struggling to get the right registration? The concern is that even if these individuals are given their papers, the actual lesson of Windrush is bigger than that and it hasn't been learned.
I think that's really the case. I mean, there's something incredibly hard to argue with about the Windrush generation. These were people who were approaching retirement, people who were, so obviously British to everybody who met them and thought about them, that the kind of it does become more complicated for a lot of voters, I suppose, when you begin to talk about people who've arrived more recently. But I think that the key lesson, and the lesson that anybody who's kind of works in the immigration and asylum sector, is that if you don't like the hostile environment being applied to people like Paulette Wilson and Anthony Bryan, why should we be treating anybody with that level of inhumanity, denying people healthcare, denying people the kind of rights to housing and so forth?
There's one question here which I think has an interesting dimension, so I'm going to ask you it, which is from Chantal, and she says, as a white woman, do you feel that your whiteness made it easier to get this story out there when previously Black, Asian and minority ethnic activists had been ignored?
So I've definitely thought about this issue a lot. It's an issue that we all need to think about in the media, because clearly, historically, across the board of the media, that it hasn't been sufficiently diverse, and The Guardian is becoming a much better organisation from that point of view. So I'm in every way acknowledging white privilege, but at the same time, I just think I was just doing my job, and as a journalist, I think it's quite important to be able to write about kind of any subject. I'm not sure.
I think the question isn't should you have written about it. I think the question is more, do you think that Black and other people who were campaigning on this didn't get their voices heard in a way that your voice might have been heard? I mean, I should just add, I was, to some degree, while I was in City Hall, looking at this developing in real time as well. And, you're quite gentle with it in your book, but, there is a section in your book where you talk about all of the people, MPs, various groups, all sorts of people, and I saw it as well, who were contacted. Some of the people who were very, very vocal later on were contacted around the same time as you. And just without criticizing them, just didn't go deeply into the story in the way that you did. I mean, people like Jackie McKenzie and Patrick Vernon do need a lot of credit, and there are lots of people like that out there, Black lawyers, Black campaigners within the Caribbean communities across the country. But, as someone who watched it in real time, your work, it wasn't as though lots of people were writing about it and you happened to be in The Guardian. There weren't that many people writing about it.
So it's absolutely the case. I mean, Jacqueline McKenzie is a lawyer who has been working on this for years and is still, who has done extraordinary work on this. But I was absolutely very angry about a number of MPs who were contacted and who weren't able to kind of get the voices of their constituents out. But I also think that I was in a position as a journalist where it was my job to be thinking about this and to be writing about this. And I became the person to whom lots of people came to talk about it. So I was able to see, I suppose, the scale of it in a way that it would have been quite hard for one MP with one constituency caseload or one lawyer working in one area, but yeah, certainly it's kind of the power of the Guardian to get an issue going on social media and to get a kind of national interest in it.
Especially if you've got an editor who's going to put it on the front page for 2 weeks in a row, that's pretty serious stuff. I would say there's a bit in the book that makes your jaw drop, which is Amber Rudd as Home Secretary talking about having to deal with a constituent who has this issue and not connecting her own constituent's issue with what she's dealing with as Home Secretary you would imagine an MP having their constituent bring this problem to them would be thinking, I need to change this rather than I need to be part of this. It's a jaw-dropping, for me, it was a jaw-dropping part of the book. I know we're almost run out of time, so I did want to ask one more question. I don't think we've got time to do it, which was about Brexit and whether the Brexit deadline is going to be a problem with registering people. And I think we're all pretty fearful of that. Amelia, thank you so much.
I'll just say yes.
Yeah.
Answer to that question.
Yeah, you think it's going to be a problem?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what the question really is asking, I'm sorry we don't have time to ask it, it's Tom Griffiths who's basically saying the deadline is so soon, is the chaos of registering people in relation to immigration status in Windrush telling us how bad it's going to be during Brexit? And your answer, Amelia Gentleman, is yes. Right. Well, Amelia, thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's been an absolutely amazing opportunity to talk. I'm sorry we couldn't talk more. People, please, I hope you go out and buy the book. You can buy it at the bookshop, the independent bookshop for the festival, which is at www.shop.edbookfest.co.uk. That's shop.edbookfest.co.uk. And there's a donation button, and please donate to the festival if you enjoyed this talk. It's free because we're all with COVID and people, unfortunately, who couldn't make it to Edinburgh. But if you did enjoy this talk and you would like to give, I'm sure it would be very gratefully received by everybody here. So there is the donation button at the end. If you'd like to donate, please do. But Amelia, all I can say is a really warm-hearted thank you, very personally, for what the story means to me and many other people. It's a fantastically important part of our lives. And thank you for sharing the story with us today. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've really loved it as well. Really, really interesting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.